always wondered, why on earth did they choose that name for their small business? Was it only a matter of ignorance, not knowing the tragic ending of the mythological story we heard during the Time for All Ages? Or was it perhaps a daring act of risk, or the expression of a particularly quirky sense of humor that caused them to name their travel agency Icarus Air Travel? I'm sorry to say, I never risked venturing in to ask them in the decade or so that I noticed their storefront on Danforth Avenue. I always thought it an astonishingly poor choice of name, bringing to mind perhaps Titanic Cruise Lines or Hindenburg dirigibles. I'm sure you can think of others. That can be your assignment for coffee time today. But today I find myself wondering whether the choice of name might not have been ignorant nor ironic after all. Perhaps this was a company that wanted to fly its customers as close to the sun of pleasure and excitement as humanly possible. Perhaps these were people who would risk it all to follow their personal calling, to give people the vacation of a lifetime, and I hope they did. Stephen Spender's poem speaks of people who, born of the sun, traveled a short while toward the sun and left the vivid air signed with their honor. He's speaking in the poem of the particularly courageous, those daring souls who did and do risk more than most for the fulfillment of a higher cause. But it seems to me that all of us are born of the sun. And all of us, in our own ways, fly for a short time toward it. Like Icarus, sometimes we overreach our grasp and come crashing down to earth. It may be, though, that in allowing ourselves to be drawn upward toward our deepest loves, ideals, and callings, we will inevitably fall, and that might help us better understand both the meaning and the beauty of the human journey. A few weeks ago, Dave and I were watching the Winter Olympics. We were particularly fascinated by the big air snowboarders. As you'll recall, the gold medal this year, in this year's inaugural event, went to a Canadian, Sébastien Touton from Quebec. Flying into the air, perched upon his board, he made 4.5 dazzling rotations in the air and landed it perfectly. But to be honest, the big air athletes that most captivated me were actually the ones that didn't win, such as the one who attempted something called a switch triple cork 1800, which included 5 full rotations. This amazingly fancy mid-air maneuver was breathtaking to watch until the snowboarder landed and couldn't stay upright. He had aimed just a little too high, and ultimately he lost the medal. But that Canadian snowboarder, Max Parrott, said he was happy to have taken that risk. Reminding me of the old familiar saying, better to have loved and lost than never to have loved at all, he said, I had the choice to do an easier trick and land on the podium, but I chose not to. I went for it. Throughout the month of March, we've been reflecting on the theme of risk in sermons and in journey groups, sharing many stories of personal risks we've taken in our lives. As many have pointed out, risk is inherent in virtually every moment we live. That made me think about the many risks built into leading a worship service. There's the risk of saying something the people in the congregation might disagree with. The risk of being seen as not put together in some way, or for my appearance or my attire being judged. There's the risk of getting facts wrong, or worse, expressing something that might reveal my own intellectual or personal limitations. There's the risk of leading a service that runs too long, been there, or a service that doesn't go long enough, that falls too short. One that includes unpopular music, seldom a risk here, I admit, an unfitting reading, or a challenging story. There's the risk of saying something inadvertently that will strike too close to home for someone, that might cause harm or hurt in some way. As I list these many risks, which do keep Sean and me up at night at times, you might notice that most of them are not really risks in a large way. Most of them, other than the risk of saying something unintentionally harmful, are risks to what I might see as my small self. Risks to my ego, to my sense of personal identity, to my personal sense of security. They're the risks of not looking good, not being right, not having it all together, falling out of favor, falling from grace. In our culture, those risks are very real to most of us. And they may prevent us from moving toward the light of selfless love in ways that might truly transform us and transform our world. It's been said, I believe, at other times this month, but is worth saying again. When we look deeply at whatever it is we're most reluctant to risk, whether it's others' disapproval, not looking good, not being in control, or having personal security, we might get a sense of where the fiery sun of our soul wants us to go. Yesterday, 18-year-old Emma Gonzalez stood before a crowd of hundreds of thousands of young people in Washington, D.C. Instead of using her time allotted to speak boldly about gun violence, for most of the 6.5 minutes, she held silence. She did so to illustrate the 6 minutes and 20 seconds it took for 17 of her classmates to be killed. It was a huge risk to say less rather than more. The risk to potentially lose control of that enormous, charged crowd. And indeed, voices broke the tension at many points with cries of, "We love you, Emma," and "Never again." Watching her hold that silence with such power and clarity, motivated purely by love and conviction, I saw again how great leaders take new and unexpected risks, venturing where others might never go. Meanwhile, in BC this week, not only Elizabeth May, but local MP Kennedy Stewart and many others were arrested this week for protesting the Trans Mountain Pipeline. Stewart said he felt a responsibility to his constituents to take that risk. In other words, he was motivated by love not only for the land, but for the people he served. There are, of course, countless examples of people who risk their freedom, their reputation, and their lives for the cause of peace or justice. Many of them become well known, in part because of the risks they take, and often because of what they lose. There are others whose risks are much more quietly taken, and they too can point us toward the light of love that can guide us in our own journeys. A few weeks ago, I went to see the documentary film Walk With Me about the Zen Buddhist teacher Thich Nhat Hanh. Now 91, he has lived in exile from his native Vietnam for many years as a result of his activism for peace. The film, though, focuses mostly on the young nuns and monks who live with him in Plum Village in southwest France, giving up virtually all the trappings of modern life to learn to live with deeper compassion and peace. They've taken the risk of letting go of money, property, possessions, sex, alcohol, and an entertaining and self-directed life in exchange for the possibility of something more. For me, the most moving scene in the film took place in a nursing home where a nun came to visit her father. Along with a group of other monastics, she had accompanied Thich Nhat Hanh to New York for a speaking engagement. And as a result, she could visit her elderly father for the first time in several years. It would not be an overstatement to say that when the two of them were reunited, their faces shone like the sun. With her face pressed close to his, she sang to him as he wept, overcome by gratitude and joy. Yet, then the camera panned left, and we could see the other family members, evidently the nun's mother and her two sisters. They looked impatient and critically judgmental, looking with stern, frowning expressions at the young woman with the shaved head and wearing the robes. Avoiding the eye of the camera and their loved ones, they pulled out their cell phones, unable and unwilling to enter into the experience of loving embrace that their relatives shared. Meanwhile, the nun and her father embraced each other, their faces radiant with love, and despite her relatives' obvious disapproval and rejection, the young woman's face remained joyful and utterly serene. In many ways, she had given up everything. She had fallen from grace as a daughter, as a sister. She had given up so many things that we feel are valuable, including, of course, the freedom to see her father more often. And yet she had gained something that was truly priceless: the ability to surrender fully and completely to deep love in the present moment, with no fear of judgment. Now, lest it appear from these stories that the only risks I feel are worth taking are dramatic ones, such as speaking before crowds of thousands, sacrificing one's freedom for justice, becoming a Buddhist monk, or catapulting off a mountain at high speed, let me bring everything back down to earth by saying again that every life calls us in the direction of great risk. And that risk we know simply as love. Every life gives us the opportunity to offer ourselves to something or to someone, to be drawn toward the sun of our deepest values, to turn toward that light as naturally as a sunflower, and to fly toward it as optimistically as Icarus. I'm both happy and sad to confirm what you all already know, that whenever we do that, we surely do fall. Things don't always work out as well as we'd hoped. We may not be quite up to the challenge we'd set for ourselves. Our beloved will turn out to be an ordinary human being, not a god. A beloved project will turn out differently than the fantasy we originally had for it. Throughout history, religious teachings from all traditions, as well as many myths and wisdom stories, teach us to fly faithfully in the direction of love, knowing that falling is part of the journey. The late Canadian songwriter Jesse Winchester had a wonderful song called "That's What Makes You Strong," and I think it illustrates the point. In the lyric, he talks about love of a person, but it could equally apply to love of a community, a congregation, a cause, or to life itself. when you love someone, then that means you need someone. And when you need someone, that's what makes you weak. But when you know you're weak, and you know you need someone, oh, it's a funny thing. That's what makes you strong. That's what makes you strong. That's what gives you power. That's what lets the meek come sit beside the king. That's what makes us smile in our final hour. That's what moves our souls, and that's what makes us sing. And to trust someone is to be disappointed. It's never what you wanted, and it happens every time. But if you're the trusting kind, that don't even cross your mind, oh, it's a funny thing. That's what makes you strong. We fly toward the light of our deepest loves and dreams, and that is how we fall. But as the poets and the sages teach us, it is also how we rise, how we deepen, how we grow. And so we can live in the deep assurance that our love is always worth the risk. Our caring for a person, for a community, for a place, for a cause, for a project, for some crazy dream that lifts us up and won't let us go. The spirit of life carries us up on wings both strong and fragile, through storms we fear may take everything from us, but that in fact may be nothing at all compared to the light of love that leads us ever on. May it always be so. Amen.